Hello, everyone. Welcome to Canadian Meets the South, Episode 4. We'll be continuing with the previous episode's topic, The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government by Jefferson Davis, Volume 2. So, this volume picks up from where the last volume took off from the war between the states, or the quote-unquote Civil War. And Jefferson Davis talks a lot about the different battles that were fought during the war between the states, or the war for Southern independence. And he also talks about a lot of the atrocities that happened during the war. Uh, a lot of private property was destroyed, and by the North, a lot of Southern property, and many women and children who were non-combatants suffered under this war. And he goes into um, the small account of General Sherman's destructive rampage when he entered Atlanta, I think, and also Charleston. Um, I might not be remembering that correctly, but for one of the cities, he gave them, I think, 5 days until for the women and children to evacuate before he could use the city as a base, and they would the northern armies would plunder the the cities, and many women and children were left to die because they had no property. Their 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 homes and their livestocks and their clothes, they were taken from them, from their houses, from their land. And many Christian pastors suffered as well, just for being Southerners. One guy, there was one account that Jefferson Davis brings up of I believe, a Lutheran minister who was very badly injured because there was a soldier who had demanded to give him the to give him some gold or something, where was he was asking where were the riches, or something like that, and he didn't and the pastor didn't know, and he got his arm severely wounded by a sword, and then later that officer who wounded him with the sword um, pleaded with him not to report him to any of the generals, and the Lutheran minister was silent. I mean, he made sure not to say it because he was showing mercy on him. But um, yeah, many Christian churches were ransacked in the South by the Northerners. And Jefferson Davis liked to bring up a lot John Quincy Adams. Um, John Quincy Adams was sent by James Madison, president at the time, to negotiate the end of the War of 1812 at Ghent. This was known as the Treaty of Ghent, and John Quincy to John Quincy Adams, it was very important that private property was not destroyed. for so many generations, at least according to Jefferson Davis, private property was sacred, and that the combatants of both sides wouldn't touch private property for many instances between civilized um, countries. It was basically a rule not to touch private property. This is what John Quincy Adams believed, and so but this property question doesn't just come down to uh, land and livestock. It also applied to people. So I mean slaves, right? Because slaves were property, and so when the Northerners started to um, free the Southern slaves and turn them against their masters, uh, Tom, Jefferson Davis says this is a violation of respecting property rights. Property rights should not be infringed. But he makes the case that it is the states that are the ones protecting them, because the federal government is not supposed to infringe at all, but the how the state how these rights are protected, how natural rights, including property rights, are protected, are from the states. And he brings up Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. It talks about natural rights, but it makes no mention of the federal government or the central government, and its role in protecting rights. It's clear that these rights belonged to were the duty of the states to protect, as the Declaration of Independence had said that they were free and independent states. And then later in the Treaty of Paris, free, sovereign, and independent states. And but Abraham Lincoln was the one who changed all of that, who changed the focus of the Declaration from the states to Thomas Jefferson's line of all men are created equal in the Declaration, and he says this is the main principle behind the founding of the United States. This is known as the proposition nation myth. I call it a myth because that's what it was. It wasn't founded. The United States Declaration of Independence was about the free and independent 13 states, and it was a secession document as well. But Abraham Lincoln completely changes the meaning of it to be about, and those words, all men are created equal. Well, the founders downplayed it, and in fact, in Connecticut in 1818, those words, all men are created equal, were in the Constitution of Connecticut, but they still discriminated heavily against blacks. I don't think blacks were allowed to vote in 1818 in Connecticut. I think they were actually banned from entering the state. Um, but that phrase isn't the most important one. Um, Abraham Lincoln flips the American Revolution on its head. He was revolutionizing the revolution because it made equality the Central American principle, not freedom and independence, even though it was literally called the Declaration of Independence. So what I was getting at before was that it was the states whose role was to protect the rights, not not the central government. The, when the Declaration was written, um, the the Continental Congress wasn't really that powerful. There weren't even the Articles of Confederation. They had not even been drafted yet. They were drafted in 1777 and then ratified in 1781. And then the Constitution was drafted 1787. So the role of the central government wasn't the focus of the Declaration of Independence. It was the states and the free and independent states. And but anyways, after the um, after the war, you would and there would be this period. This period in history is called Reconstruction. In well, first after the war, not long after the war, there was the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and I think those the assailants also tried to assassinate Andrew Johnson, but he he managed to stay alive, and then he actually sent an order to try to arrest Jefferson Davis, and he tried to make it sound like the assailants were acting under Jefferson Davis's orders, even though they weren't. And Jefferson Davis talks about how he tried to escape, but he didn't. He was jailed, but he didn't face a treason charge. They couldn't. I mean, he never got into court. Like the treason charge was dropped before they even got a chance to go to court. And like the chief Supreme Court Justice Chase, uh, he there's no way he would have been able to do that because to to give him a sentence for treason. Anyways, he knew that. Chase knew that because if you look at the words of Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution, it says against them, referring like to treason as was defined as waging war against them being the United States, or giving aid or comfort to their allies. But Jefferson Davis doesn't really talk about his treason charge. At least I don't remember. What he does talk about was the subjugation of the Southern people. It was divided. The South was divided into four quarters. No, four, and they were each directed by a major general. At least they were supposed to. It was supposed to be like temporarily under a military government until they could have a voting until a Republican form of government, a government voted for by the people. But the problem was that um, this these governments weren't exactly Republican. I mean, as you know, in Article 4, Section 4 of the United States Constitution, it says the United States shall guarantee all um, all states a Republican form of government. However, uh, military dictatorship does not qualify as a Republican form of government. And what the military did once voting was installed was strongly influence how the state constitutions were drafted, and those state constitutions would make it clear that the United States government was and the United States Constitution were supreme, even though it was the founders had created a union in which the states were supreme, not not the central government. Um, so not only did the military strongly influence how the state constitutions were drafted, but they also strongly influenced elections. Oftentimes, they would tell soldiers to um, ask the voters to take the Pledge of Allegiance, to take a Pledge of Allegiance, which would mean that they would be first swear allegiance to the United States central government, basically, and um, many of them couldn't, or many of them just decided not to, while others would, and so and how do I say it? Because of the 14th Amendment, which um, they banned most Confederate soldiers, or how do I say it? Um, all those Confederate soldiers who voluntarily signed up, and those Confederate soldiers who were conscripted but then voluntarily supported the war, the Confederacy would be not allowed to vote, um, and as a as an as a as an entry requirement for Congress, uh, you had to swear that you had never uh, waged war against the United States, and so many Confederate soldiers couldn't do that. And um, so the number of white men who were able to vote in the constitutional conventions, as well as general elections, were outnumbered by blacks, and so you can imagine the racial tensions being very high because blacks were most of the time in the majority in the southern states uh, with regards to voting. Interestingly, um, women weren't allowed to vote because even though the feminist movement in the North supported this war, the war of, to prevent Southern independence, because they believe that they would have a big egalitarian revolution with this war. The problem is that if women get the vote throughout the Union, then white women in the South were going to vote Democrat instead of Republican. And then the Democrats would be much more of a strong force during uh, Reconstruction. Uh, and Andrew Johnson, Jefferson Davis really gives it to Andrew Johnson, saying that he was being unfair to the South. He was being hard on the South, and when the the Congress, which was controlled largely by radical Republicans, the Republicans would um, do things against, no, who would often overturn some of Andrew Johnson's vetoes, and they even impeached Andrew Johnson. Jefferson Davis said, like, why does it even matter that they're fighting each other? They both violated the Constitution by supporting the war on the South. He This was written in 1781, the rise and fall of the Confederate government, but he doesn't really talk so much about Grant's presidency. It was towards the end. It was mostly talking about the time during Andrew Johnson's presidency, because that was the, I guess, the first, most of the first part of Reconstruction. They both in the 1876 election, both Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel J. Tilden both promised to to pull the troops out of the South and Reconstruction. But Jefferson Davis doesn't really go that far. I guess another thing that I should to talk about was George McClellan. He was mentioned a lot. He was, maybe if you if you listen to some people, I don't know. He was he it might not have sounded like he wanted the war, but he was in a lot of battles fighting for the Union, and then he somehow became the Democratic nominee in 1864 to run against Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. But he's mostly mentioned as another Union general who was fighting against the South. If McClellan had won in 1864, I think he would have stopped the war, and then he would have just pursued peace. He wouldn't have tried to conquer the South, because a lot of Northern men died from the war to prevent Southern independence. So um, he was. Things could have turned out differently if he had become president rather than Abraham Lincoln winning re-election. That war, well, Jefferson Davis doesn't really talk about it, but the election of 1864, it was really close. I mean, Abraham Lincoln didn't win a majority of the popular vote in 1860, won less than 40%, and what Jefferson Davis calls a sectional majority, because when democracy is at such a wide scale, such a big scale, because as the United States had grown, eventually, yeah, you have a sectional majority in which none of the southern states supported Abraham Lincoln in 1860. I know he wasn't even on the ballot for some of those southern states, but it was a sectional majority. And I know Harry Jaffa, when he was debating Tom DiLorenzo in 2002 at the Independent Institute, he said that those over 100,000 Southern soldiers who fought for the Union, they didn't have a voice. Well, I don't think that means they would have voted Republican. Many Northern Democrats supported the war, and some Southern Whigs, they even voted for John C. Bell. I mean, John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party. No, neither they voted neither for the Democrats, either of the Democrats, the Breckinridge, or what's his name, Douglas, and they didn't vote for the Republican Lincoln either. He actually doesn't talk too much about Hamlin, the Republican vice president, the first vice president under uh, Abraham Lincoln, but I'm not sure how much he ever did, if he did any tie-breaking votes. But uh, yeah, Abraham Lincoln, he revolutionized the revolution, as I said before, completely changing the meaning of the Declaration of Independence, and installing the nationalist myth of into the United States. I'll finish off by talking a little bit about how it relates to Canada, because I think I've already mentioned this, but Judah P. Benjamin, who was Jefferson Davis's right-hand man, he served under three rules. I think Secretary of State, Secretary of War, and Attorney General. He talked about how the Pope didn't really recognize the Confederacy. He said that he sort of no that he remarked about to Jefferson Davis about how he felt like a prisoner in his own country, because like at this time, the Vatican was like the land outside the Vatican was being conquered, and those were once papal lands. But Judah P. Benjamin, well, this isn't in the book or anything in The Rise and Fall of the Confederate States, but he said this wasn't really an endorsement or a recognition of the Confederacy. Judah P. Benjamin later went on to become a barrister in England, and he participated in legal disputes between the provinces and the Dominion of Canada, or well, they called it the Dominion back then, but we call it the federal government. But yeah, I can barely find anything on the internet about Judah P. Benjamin's rules in those constitutional cases, which were put forth in the Privy Council, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, because back then the Supreme Court of Canada wasn't the highest court in the land. It was the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. But yeah, the war led to the Canadian Constitution, the British North America Act of 1867, becoming more centralized and less states' rights-ish compared to the United States Constitution. But at least in Canada now, we seem to be more decentralized than the United States. And the Supreme Court of Canada, which is part of the federal government, at least recognizes the right of secession for any province. So it's not like in Canada the federal government is going to invade a province for seceding and not wanting to pay taxes, like what Andrew Jackson threatened and what Abraham Lincoln actually did. But yeah, maybe one day the South will rise again, and the American tradition, the principle of the American Revolution, secession, as Timothy Pickering, the Secretary of State under George Washington, and later Secretary of War under George Washington. He was Secretary of War and Secretary of State under George Washington, and then later John Adams. He was the Secretary of State. Timothy Pickering, the leader of the he became later the leader of the New England secessionists, and his political career died at no at near the end of the War of 1812. Around the Hartford Convention, when people realized the New England Federalists wanted to secede. But one day, I hope the United States will come to realization that the principle of secession is the chief principle of the American Revolution, because after all, the Declaration of Independence was a secessionist document. Thank you.